Um, well, I mean, let's kind of get started into, I guess, maybe a little bit about your background. Why did you choose sports psychology in specific? Because I know it's like a lot of athletes, they'll go to they'll want to do sports medicine or they'll want to do physical therapy after they kind of go through that after they go through like their schooling. Why did you choose sports psychology in specific?
hmm So I started out as a psychology major in my undergraduate degree. I was really interested in people and trying to understand their behavior and why they did what they did. And when I was in college, I was also a college athlete. So I was a swimmer. And during my sophomore year of college, I tore my rotator cuff. And that's a pretty devastating injury for a swimmer because you're using your shoulders for everything. So during that time, I was struggling with my rehabilitation and didn't really know how to handle the mental part of going through an injury and being away from my sports for such a long period of time. And so it was during that time that I learned about sports psychology in a class. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with sports psychology, but I knew I wanted to pursue it further. So that's really what took me on the trajectory to studying, getting a master's degree, and then eventually a PhD and getting my certification in sports psychology.
I mean, honestly, I feel like it's such a unique field and it's something that I also want to be doing when I'm older. I kind of started this project so that I could, I guess, share a little bit more about this entire world of sports psychology with athletes in badminton, because in the United States, badminton is just like a super underserved sport. Like we don't have a lot of financial resources or a lot of recognition.
Mhm.
But I think it's really, really cool what you do and what a lot of sports psychologists do because it's kind of focusing on an entirely different aspect of the game. Like not entirely physical, but there is also some it's like 50-50, mental and physical. Like both of them are important. And you
Mhm.
kind of mentioned that injury that you had after you were a competitive college swimmer, you had a rotator cuff injury. Is that something that you work with, uh, like the athletes that you work with now? Is that something you work with them on, kind of getting over their injuries?
Yeah, I work with athletes for a variety of, I mean, there's a variety of reasons why they might come to me and work together. Some of it might be things are going really well and they just want to continue learning skills and improving. But then you have athletes who might come because they're experiencing challenges in their sport. Some of those challenges might be related to injury and being away from their sport because that is a major transition is when you're playing your sport and then all of a sudden it's taken away and isolation can occur where you're not spending as much time with your teammates. um you're not being as physically active, so that could influence your mood. There's just a lot that goes into it. So yeah, working with athletes during the injury and recovery process is extremely important to help them adjust and have a healthy recovery and return to play.
Okay. And what does a session kind of look like for you? Like when you're kind of walking the athlete through maybe that more difficult phase. What's like a technique or something that you tell them in order to kind of keep their confidence and their esteem high?
hmm I mean, it really depends on each athlete. Like every athlete is going to have a different experience when it comes to, um, we'll say like injury, for example. Some athletes might be like, "Hey, I've been injured before, so I know what to do. I know I have to do my rehab. I know that there's going to be a lot of ups and downs." And so if an athlete already has that experience, it might be something to help them lean upon. And they can draw from the previous time they were injured and know that, okay, if I follow my rehab, if I'm getting enough rest and prioritizing the things that I need to, like nutrition and recovery, then hey, I can make it back to my sport. But maybe it looks a little bit different for an athlete who's never been injured before. They probably have a lot of question marks about the process. Maybe their emotions are heightened. They might feel more fear um, of what this time is going to look like, or they might be afraid as they're getting closer to return to play to use the same muscle groups that were injured because they don't want to get re-injured. So there can
Yeah.
be that fear and that lack of confidence that play in. So in those cases, um, it would be about like gradual gains, and just thinking about like celebrating the small wins and trying to build up confidence in small, manageable chunks.
Okay. And I mean, I know that you work with youth athletes and you used to be a collegiate athlete yourself. Do you think there's a different way that maybe a mental performance professional would communicate this type of information to the youth athletes that you work with? And like, how does it differ? Is it more like contextual or
Yeah, so I've done quite a bit of work at the college level, specifically with Division I athletes. I worked at a few different universities. And then I've also worked with youth athletes. I mean, anything under 18, I've worked with starting with 4 and 5 year olds. Which I mean, that's going to look a lot different than working with maybe a 17-year-old, like junior, senior in high school who's going to be graduating soon. So, I think the biggest thing is I'd say two things. I would say tailor your message to your audience. From a developmental standpoint, kids, their brains are still developing. And so if you're using complicated language or talking really heavily about theory, they're probably going to get bored and just tune you out and say, okay, this is really complicated. I don't care. So it's really important, especially at the younger ages, to keep your sessions fun. Sometimes I like to tell stories. So, for example, if I'm teaching about like persistence and hard work and determination, I might use the story of the little train that could. And the train goes, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And so there's elements of the train using that like positive self-talk, but also even though the train didn't think he could make it up the mountain, he kept trying. And so using stories like that can be really helpful for youth because they like listening to stories. Even using like movie quotes or different movies to explain points. Like we'll talk about now I'm losing track of the movie. What's the one that talks about emotions?
Inside Out?
Inside Out. Yes. Thank you. So, using a movie reference like Inside Out to talk about how kids can have big emotions and it's okay to have those emotions. But, when they experience those emotions, what can they do with them? Maybe it's about you have them go talking to a friend or to a trusted adult, or maybe it's emotion regulation exercises, like you teach them to do some belly breathing to help them regulate themselves. So I think with youth, you have to be a lot more creative when it comes to explaining things in terms that are going to make sense to them and stories that they can then remember and apply to themselves.
Okay. Um, so kind of, I guess, shifting over to like the issues that maybe athletes kind of have. So I used to shadow at this orthopedic surgeon facility where there was like a really, really common issue where like 50% of the patients had this knee issue. And it got so common to the point where the person in charge of the clinic had like a sheet that they printed out and they would give it to every single person who had that issue because it was just such a common issue. Is there anything kind of like that that you see when you're working with athletes? Is there like a really, really common issue and like maybe like the most common mental performance issue that you see in junior athletes? And if so, what is that one technique, that one solution that you always propose to them?
That's a great question. And I'll be honest, I wish that sports psychology were that easy. But when we think about it, sports psychology is about the mind, and if we can't quantify the mind. Our brains are so complex and our emotions are so complex. And so that's what makes my job fun is I get to work with people one on one to help understand what's happening with their thought processes, what's happening with their emotions. And so um, I guess that being said, if I am looking at some common things that come up for athletes, I think managing performance anxiety is really important. Lots of athletes will get some of those nerves before they compete, and that's totally okay. That's totally normal. It's actually your body's way of telling you that you really care about the event and it's important to you and you want to do well. And so when you have those nerves, I'll work with athletes to think about how are we framing those thoughts and those physiological changes in the body, right? Like maybe we get some sweaty palms when we're nervous. All right, that's okay. Or maybe we get like sort of this kind of like butterflies in our stomach, or we have to go to the bathroom right before we compete. And in those cases, I mean, those are physiological reactions to your body preparing itself for competition. You don't need any waste like that in your body. So your body is you're going to have to go to the bathroom to try and eliminate some of that waste because you don't need it. It's not going to help you for competition. So that's how your body prepares itself. So if athletes can reframe some of those physical symptoms and think, no, this isn't something to be afraid of. It's just my body getting itself ready to be the best that it can be. It can help athletes understand their anxiety better and have more balanced thoughts about it. Another thing I see is challenges with confidence. With athletes, there can be, I mean, there's such an emphasis on comparison, whether it's comparing your team against other teams or comparing yourself to other competitors. And so when that happens, sometimes confidence can take a dip. And so one thing I'll work with athletes is instead of comparing themselves so much to others, thinking about comparing themselves to who they were yesterday or who they were a week ago or a month ago. And when you have those like self-referenced like expectations, those self-referenced goals, then it's easier to see progress and build up some of that confidence because it's not dependent on other people, but it's dependent on your hard work and your effort and the way that you're improving each day.
I think one thing that's really interesting about what you just said is kind of like building that confidence. Some advice that I've heard is like you kind of treat it like a brick wall. Your foundation from yesterday is zero, and then each, I guess, good thing, each tiny win, you're stacking a brick on top, and then you build that confidence over time. So then when you have like maybe a bad loss, one bad loss won't destroy the brick wall altogether. But I think it's like I think it's a really, really interesting process of kind of developing confidence. Um, so how do you kind of help athletes understand that like it's going to be a long-term process? Because like sometimes with me as well, and I'm sure that a lot of people kind of relate to this, but I think people like results to come fast. It's not always super easy to wait. How do you kind of stick in it for the long run?
hmm I totally agree with you. I think that we do live in a society where we want things to happen very quickly. I mean, if you think about it, we have our phones, we have computers, we have all of this technology at our fingertips where we've now grown accustomed to getting information with just a few clicks. And so that can lead us to sometimes get impatient when it comes to other things. Um, we know that building some of these skills, it takes time. Like athletes don't just get good at their sport overnight. They have to practice their skills and be dedicated to putting in the work to develop them. And it's the same thing when it comes to the mental side of sport. We don't just flip a switch and all of a sudden we're really strong mentally. We also have to develop those skills by practicing them on a regular basis. And having them tested and trying to troubleshoot and figure out how to navigate problems when they happen. So I think that's a comparison I would give to athletes is you didn't get good at your sport overnight. You put in a lot of hard work and dedication. So how can you expect the mental side to be any different? Um, and so I think that's a key piece is just having that conversation about um, the process rather than the outcome. And lots of times we're so geared towards the outcome and seeing results that we forget about the growth that happens when we take it one step at a time, and focus more on that process. I think also the process isn't always fun. Like it's a lot
Yeah.
more fun and exciting to share about the outcomes and all of the cool accomplishments. But the process is a really important piece that we can't ignore. And lots of times that's kind of like the longer piece that athletes will find themselves in. So if we can find little joys during the process and find ways to celebrate our successes before getting to like the big outcome, that can help build up confidence along the way too and reduce some of the sole focus on outcomes only.
So it's kind of, I guess, focusing or noticing those little wins during the process rather than focusing on those outcome-oriented goals or just focusing
Yeah,
solely on the outcome. Okay.
absolutely.
And I mean, I know that maybe most junior athletes don't just have the input of a mental performance professional or a sports psychologist. Parents and coaches may also kind of play a role in how an athlete views themselves or how their identity shapes. And I know that your research specifically focuses pretty heavily on a coach's role in creating these environments for healthy athlete development. So what do you think is one thing that a coach does that maybe builds or breaks that environment without the coach really realizing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when we think about sports, there's so many different people that are involved. I mean, there's the athlete themselves. There could be some sibling influence. Like kids might play a sport because their siblings play it. There's the parents involved, there's the coaches, there's the administrators, all of the sports specialists like athletic trainers, registered dietitians, all of it. So there's a lot of people that are acting on the athlete. But coaches, they have a really important role because an athlete is going to be in contact with them for a majority of their training time. And so I think especially at the youth level, one thing that we see is um, coaches tend to focus on winning. And I would say even sometimes a little bit too much on trying to develop develop the sport skills. And I know that sounds like kind of a crazy thing to say, but what I mean by that is youth sport, it's really important that there's fun in it. It's really important that athletes have the opportunity to move their bodies and make friends and learn how to communicate with their coaches and their peers. And sometimes when so much emphasis is placed on outcomes like winning, um, then some of that emphasis gets shifted away from the fun and just like the initial learning the skills to more of this elite development pathway. Um, and unfortunately, it can be a recipe for kids dropping out of sport. So I think what coaches can do is just bring it back to the basics of how do we have fun in sport? Also, how do we teach the basic skills, like the fundamentals of the sport? And then how can we also teach life skills through sport? Things like hard work, perseverance, teamwork. Those skills are really important. So I think that's something really important that coaches should pay attention to. I had another thought related to that. I think it's related to what we call a motivational climate. And that's basically the environment that the coach is creating. And so There's a lot that plays into it, but if coaches can give athletes what we call autonomy, that's this idea that they get to have some choice in their workouts. They get to have some choice when it comes to their sport. That's something that can be really beneficial to athletes. And so having more of like an environment that supports autonomy choice as opposed to controlling coach environments can pay dividends for athletes.
Okay. And what about parents? What can they do? Because I know that a lot of my friends sometimes may have some pressure that comes from family. Um,
Mhm.
and I mean, I, I would never say that it's something that you should like tell a parent how to, I guess, talk to their kid. But like, what's like the, I guess, method for kind of getting them on board as well? Because from what I understand, all of the puzzle pieces kind of have to be there because there's, so, like you said, there's so many people who are important to an athlete's development. How do you kind of get them on board?
Yeah, I think parents are a very important piece of this puzzle. I mean, parents are typically the ones who are paying for the sport experience. They might be the ones who are getting their children to practices. And maybe they're even volunteering at competitions. So parents play a really important role. And so sometimes I think parents get a bad rap. Um, like people will think about maybe the overly involved parents that are screaming at their child when they're up at bat and they're like, swing. But, I think when we think about those overly involved parents, they're very well meaning. They typically want what's best for their child and they want to help their child. But I think what parents don't realize is when they do become over involved, it actually puts a lot of pressure on kids and it can detract from some of the fun of the sport for them. So I think advice that I'd give to parents, and I would actually be okay giving this type of advice. I think that parent education is important. So what I would say is like really pay attention to what is an appropriate level of involvement for your child in their sport. Um, like when it comes to your behaviors, model the behaviors that you want your child to be doing. So if you want your child to display good sportsmanship, well, you as a parent should be modeling that on the sidelines. So if the referee makes a call that's tough, it's probably not a good idea for the parent to be screaming at the referee because then the children see that and they learn that it's okay to scream at the referees because their parents do it. So I would say for parents, just pay attention to what your involvement looks like. Lots of times they're probably a little bit more involved than they think they are. So just like keep that in mind. And then also model those behaviors that you want to see in your child. And when it comes to talking about it, the coach is the coach. All right. Unless the parent is like the actual parent slash coach, you are not the coach. So leave the coaching to the coaches. And as a parent, your role is to help support your child in sport. And so you might ask your child, hey, did you have fun today? And did you play to the best of your abilities? And if they had fun and they played to the best of their abilities, that's what you would want.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, well, Dr. Weekesser, I don't want to keep you, um, I guess, busy for too much longer. Uh, but I guess coming up is probably my favorite question of the entire interview. And so there's this podcast that I really, really like. It's called The Diary of a CEO. And they have a tradition on that podcast where they'll ask the previous guest for a question, and they'll ask that question to the next guest. So it's kind of like, yeah, so it's like a continuation of the conversation between guests as well. And I think it's just an incredibly amazing tradition. So I kind of stole that tradition and brought it to these interviews. And right before I interviewed you, I actually interviewed Dr. Duncan Simpson, and he is the director of Dartmouth's Mental Performance Peak Performance Center. And he wanted me to ask you if you could redesign how kids are taught to handle failure starting in elementary school, what's the very first thing that you would change?
Hmm. Oh, that's a great question. I think I would incorporate more failure in elementary school. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes I don't know if you've ever maybe been playing a game with like a little sibling or, like a niece or nephew or just a young child, and you you don't want them to lose, right? Like you go slower because you want them to win, or you kind of like slough off so that they can beat you. And, I think that's, of course, there's always space for that. But, if kids don't ever have an opportunity to fail, then when they actually come across challenges, they haven't built up the coping skills to be able to manage those difficult times. And so if we can introduce challenging situations and failure early on, then that's a great opportunity to start teaching children certain coping skills that they can use to handle those challenges. And so as they get older, those skills that they started when they were little, they'll be able to keep building upon them. And so as the challenges get increasingly difficult, well, their coping skills are going to get increasingly better, and they'll be able to keep building those. So that's what I would say is. Now, I'm going to put a caveat to this, but what I would say is introduce failure, introduce challenging situations where kids might fail, but do it in a supportive environment where there's adults there that can help the kids as they navigate those challenges. The reason I say that is because if we just throw kids to the wolves and give them challenges and let them fail without supporting them, to me, that feels somewhat irresponsible. But if we give them challenges, but we show them some support, then we're pairing with them to help teach them how to handle those things early on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually connected to what you just said. I attended my little sister's middle school orientation, so she's just going to sixth grade. And they had like this slideshow presentation, and one of the slides was on they gave all of the parents this like assigned reading. And the book was called The Gift of Failure.
Mm,
And I guess the message that they were trying to leave on all of the parents was, middle school is this time where your students, your kids are going to become advocates for their own education. And so kind of allowing them to maybe do it themselves, fail, and then learn with your support, that's the way that it should kind of be. And I think I completely agree with you. I think it's something that should be introduced early and I don't know. What you said just immediately reminded me of that book and that presentation.
yeah, I love that. That was like, I mean, essentially a parent education of, um, you know, an example of saying, hey, parents, this is a time where your kid might fail, but here's how you can support them and help them build up these skills, so they can be more autonomous learners. So it's cool that we're seeing it not just maybe in sports, but also in schools too.
I mean it's just a super cool development.
Hmm.
Um, well, Dr. Weekesser, if somebody who's watching maybe wanted to follow your work, maybe book a session with you or take a look at some of the stuff that you're working on currently, do you have like a website or maybe some socials that they could kind of look at if they wanted to book a session with you or like continue to look at what you're doing?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably the one of the best ways to find me. I'm really responsive to my messages on there, so they can find me at Meredith Weekesser. And then also you can send me an email. I am a professor at the at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And so they can send me a message there, and those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today. It was honestly, it was a really good conversation. I loved learning from you because there were a lot of things that, I mean, I feel like every single person that I've spoken to thus far uh, always brings up this concept of outcome-based learning versus
Hmm.
process-based learning. And it's super interesting to kind of get everybody's unique perspective on what that means. Because even though that concept shows up every single time, I think everyone explains it a little bit differently. And they don't explain it, they don't always agree with maybe what other people are saying. But I think that
Hmm.
was it's just really, really interesting to hear. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this for me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me to do this. And yeah, let me know if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too. Nice to meet you. Bye.
See you.